The dog days of the hockey summer are upon us, but don't you fear, Steele and I are going to break down every single hot topic when it comes to fantasy hockey that you're going to need to know to dominate your draft all summer long, including on today's episode, a big-time buyout from Vancouver, what's going on with the San Jose Sharks, and the Edmonton Oilers looking to make some big-time moves. Let's get right to it.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to your source for off-season hockey and fantasy news. It's the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Mr. Steele Roden. Make sure you check out his work all across YouTube, under NHL Quick Hits, and, of course, all over the NHL Locked On Network. I'm your boy, Big Flip Livingstone. Thank you for making us your first listen every single day. We appreciate it even here through the offseason. Like I mentioned, Steele, I already miss hockey. Vegas went off. They had their party. A lot of really fun moments from that, and good for them. But we got to get down to business because you and I know you're even in a league that drafts very early. There's no rest for the fantasy wicked. So on today's episode, what does it mean for the Vancouver Canucks and the Oliver Ekman-Larsson buyout? What's his fantasy value? That might be a short conversation, Steele. Erik Karlsson working a deal. You know he's going to be elsewhere soon. What are the Sharks going to do with this massive piece of talent, and what will it mean for his fantasy value? And lastly, the Oilers, I think this makes the most sense, perhaps, Steele, out of all these rumors that we're looking at. They're looking to get a little younger, boost that talent pool. I'm excited for today's episode. Tuesday's episode. Hit me with your take on this Oliver Ekman-Larsson situation, though, because honestly, what was Jim Benning thinking with this deal?
Look, they had to make this move. They had to buy Oliver Ekman out. He's at a point in his career and at a point at 32 years old where he's just not getting anything done when he's on the ice. And, you look back to what the actual contract was. He signed an 8-year deal, $66 million contract with Arizona back in July of 2018. He then gets traded to Vancouver in 2021. And with 4 years remaining left on his contract, gets bought out in July or in June of 2023. He has 4 years left on that contract. So he gets bought out because, again, you look at the last 4 years, half with Vancouver and half with Arizona, 30 or less points. He was a minus 24 last season. His shots, his blocks, his hits, all down. He secured the money, and right when he signed that contract, his career went basically over a cliff. He had 5 very impressive seasons from 2014 to 2019, but after that, couldn't get anything done. He wasn't the same type of defenseman in his own zone. Yeah. He wasn't the same defenseman on the power play, which he used to be able to quarterback very nicely, might I add. But when he was at his prime, 28 years old, he wasn't really in his prime. His career was pretty much over, and you could see it when he was on the ice every single time.
This is a guy who's finished in the top 20 in Norris voting before heading to Vancouver 5 times out of 7 seasons, Steele. And look, there is no ever telling how a guy's career is going to go. But paying him that much money at that age, I think just for what Jim Benning was willing to do, and I know that whole situation with Arizona and Vancouver was in flux at the time. But my goodness, did it not work out for the Vancouver Canucks? And you mentioned his numbers going down, and I think what was perhaps most indicative of him losing his confidence is the Oliver Ekman-Larsson I remember that I used to love having on my fantasy team.
Yeah.
He crushed people. 167 hits, 154 hits, 160 hits, 3 years in a row, and then 105 hits for Vancouver. 58 hits last year. And I know he only played 54 games, but it seemed that he lost his mojo, Steele. And I hear people crying about all the money that Vancouver had to spend to pay this guy to go away. It's time for him to go away. This is a positive for the Vancouver Canucks, in my opinion. They had to turn the page, Steele, from Brucey B this year to all the off-ice issues to, that fire torture of a press conference. There was just so many things went wrong this year. And I think this is actually one of the things the Canucks have gotten right in a long time.
This is something they got right, and they had to make this change in order to change their future. You've got many young guys on this team. They got to add another defenseman now. Pretty much only have Quinn Hughes. You now have Philip Bronek as well in that trade last year from the Detroit Red Wings.
I like that.
But yeah, definitely like those two players, but they're going to need some help on the blue line. For Oliver Ekman-Larsson, though, pretty much zero fantasy value whatsoever. But where could this guy actually land next season? The team that I have in mind is actually the Philadelphia Flyers. I think they could use a veteran talent right now. They already traded Ivan Provorov. It looks like Tony DeAngelo's on his way out as well. They're trying to make some room for those young guys on the blue line, like Cam York, Sean Walker, Travis Sanheim. All those young guys that they have on the blue line are going to get a lot more opportunity, even some guys that are still some prospects right now. So maybe the Flyers go out and get Ekman-Larsson for a short-term, short contract deal, and he can just be a veteran player who can play on that third D pairing and sort of just mentor these young guys who are getting a big opportunity for the Flyers this upcoming season.
Not only do I wholeheartedly agree, I think the alleyway for this guy to build any sort of value back for himself is to not only go to a team that has to be, at that bottom of the group of the table to give him this opportunity. I don't know why you would want to risk, if you're a team right there on the cusp, why do you want to roll the dice with a guy that honestly, Steele, though, before the last few years, this conversation that you and I are having about him and his fantasy value would have been very different. Can he turn back the clock? These are some very, very big questions. If I'm a fantasy GM, though, I am not going near this guy with a 10-foot pole unless maybe he lands somewhere very beneficial. I don't know, Steele. Maybe he lands on a second or third pairing on a really good team. Let's see what happens. But at the end of the day, I think this is actually going to mean big things for the Vancouver Canucks, turning it around over the next couple of seasons. You mentioned Hughes. We mentioned, we like Kuzmenko. Obviously, Pettersson is nasty up front. The Vancouver Canucks are probably due for another rough ride this season, though, Steele. Yeah. But we're going to continue to talk about a few other seasons for Erik Karlsson, the San Jose Sharks. What do you do with Karlsson if you're a Sharks owner? What if you're a GM of his? I mean, fantasy-wise, of course. Oilers, though, Steele. I'm ready to get to that final segment because you know me and my Oilers futures bets. I got a few things I want to run by you as well about the Edmonton Oilers. But today's episode is brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. And for a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is the correct fit. And it's the exact same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head over to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure the right part fits the first time round. Just add your ride to the My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game, and when you shop at eBay Motors with over 102 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
And thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. We are a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you can find your favorite team from all four major sports leagues, including the NCAA as well. Your team every single day. And thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode with Flip and I. Make sure you hit the subscribe, hit the follow button. We appreciate all the support you show us every single day. And we hope that we're supporting you somehow with your fantasy hockey teams this offseason and for next season as well. Somehow we hope we're helping you. Maybe with your big time bets. Who knows how we're helping you.
Who knows?
As long as we're as long as we're helping just a smidge out there.
A little bit at a time, Steele.
Little chipping away at it, Flip, every single day. Erik Karlsson, though, they're chipping away at this trade deal, trying to get something going for Erik Karlsson. He's been in that trade rumor box, it seems like, for the last year and a half with the San Jose Sharks. But this offseason could finally be the offseason that we see Karlsson moved yet again.
Aside from the obvious fact that they're going to get the absolute most value for Erik Karlsson now because of how good he has been, obviously, $11.5 million over the next 4 years is going to be a caveat. Mike Grier, the GM, new GM of the San Jose Sharks, is going to want to put his stamp on this team. And he's starting to do it with the Timo Meier move, some other peripheral small moves. But I think this is really going to be, and not because Erik Karlsson is a quote-unquote face of the franchise, but this is for a new GM, Steele, moving a player of this value, potentially getting back the pieces that we think he could get. I think Erik Karlsson, knowing how much credit Mike Grier is getting from, NHL analysts and other GMs around the league, he sounds like he knows what he's doing already. You're going to move this guy before training camp starts. You're going to want a fresh page, a fresh start, and if there's some young prospects, you're going to want to give them some run out in some of those preseason games and maybe let them run a few games to start the year. So, in my opinion, Erik Karlsson, and I was wrong about his output. You were right. You said 100-plus points, and actually 101 is an accurate prediction. So, kudos to you because I wasn't expecting 76 assists from Erik Karlsson. But at the end of the day, Steele, 101 points is not going to be repeated. But
no,
you can't help but feel he's not going to be moved to any, and I believe he has a no movement clause. I'll check that in a sec. He's not going to any team that's not a contender. He's going to a contender. So I think his fantasy value stays right there near some of the best offensive defensemen in the game.
Well, you look at where Erik Karlsson was drafted in most fantasy leagues last year. We're talking like 16th, 17th, 18th round for the most part, majority of it. So it was an absolute steal. Whoever was able to draft Erik Karlsson in last year's fantasy season, an absolute steal. One of the biggest fantasy draft steals last year. I know there's a few other guys that we could mention.
And he's likely still, if you don't mind me jumping in quick, he is that kind of player that if you were lucky enough to draft him this year, you were probably right there in the mix as the winner of that league. He was that good.
Oh, for sure. Erik Karlsson's the type of guy, if you get him in that, especially in those late rounds, your team is a game changer for your fantasy hockey team. And I think it's going to be the same way next year. Obviously, like you said, he's probably not going to put up 100-plus points again, but it looks like he has his groove back. It looks like he has that jump in his step, and he's skating a lot better than we've seen him over the last 2 years or 3 years. And again, quarterbacking the power play. He's so quick with his edge work and his feet. That's really what we see, just him walking the blue line and finding those openings to get the puck on net. The one team that I really think could go for it, and again, maybe swing for the fences, they have the cap space, they have some picks, and is a contender right now, is the Seattle Kraken. They've got a ton of cap space right now, $20 million in cap space. You look at the contracts on their team, they don't have one guy over $5.5 million. Sorry, one guy is over 5.5, and that's Philip Grubauer, their goaltender. So they've got some really friendly deal contracts right now. Over the next few years, obviously they're gonna have to figure out some of those young guys. But even this offseason, Morgan Geekie, Daniel Sprong, Vince Dunn, Cale Fleury, those guys are gonna have to be taken care of, obviously. But with $20 million in cap space, 26 draft picks over the next 3 years, they have a lot of value to capitalize on an Erik Karlsson trade, and we've seen it this year. They went up against the Colorado Avalanche, stunned them in 7 games. They went up to against the Dallas Stars, took them to 7 games as well. This team is legit. They're only in they're going to be heading into their 3rd year next season. This team looks legit right now.
It does, Steele. Very interesting that you bring up the Kraken. I like this angle at this point, and I think I mentioned this to you quickly off air, because we are still ahead of that July 1 free agency buzz. It's going to be really hard for me to project where he actually goes. Maybe after some of these dominoes fall after the first couple of days, maybe it'll become a little bit more clear. You and I will have all of that reaction, analysis, fantasy news on the show. So make sure you're not missing any of that. But at the end of it all, Steele, for real, I think given how good he is, this is just such a good situation for the San Jose Sharks. And I mentioned Mike Grier. And at the end of it all, I think when he goes to the contender we expect him to, just make sure you're drafting him in the right round. Remember that 101 points was a big outlier over the last couple. And not saying that he's not going to produce, maybe, what do you think, Steele? I think 75, 80 points is very fair. He's a very good fantasy blue liner option. I just buyer beware, because he ain't going back to 101. So don't take him in the second round.
I think 85 points, maybe 90 on the high side, is not out of the question. Okay. Again, this is the first time in This is the first time in 4 years he's played a full season, 82 games. Again, you go back to the 2020 season, it was a 56-game season, and he did play the full 56 games. But again, it's not 82. You don't get the full aspect of the entire 82
Injuries have been
season.
a factor.
Exactly. But this is the first time he played a full 82-game season in a long time, and he put up some great numbers, 25 goals, 101 points. The blocks were up, the shots were up, the average ice time was at 25 and a half minutes this past season. So a guy that can, again, if he goes to a cup contending team, he is a difference maker on the blue line. So again, from going from the 18th round to potentially jumping up 9 rounds, maybe landing himself in the 11th or 10th, that's a good possibility for Erik Karlsson. Obviously not the top 3 or the top 5 rounds, but his fantasy value has definitely skyrocketed.
And later in the show, let's talk about the Edmonton Oilers. Let's talk about some of these pieces that they might be trying to acquire still, because look, they bow out to the Vegas Golden Knights in 6 games. They gave them a ride. They go on to win the cup. I believe last season, who did they bow out to? They bowed out to the cup winner again, didn't they? They've gone up against some really good teams. You know me on my futures bet with the Edmonton Oilers. Thank you very much, Colorado Avalanche. I think they're a piece or two away. So let's talk about this Oilers team right around the break.
Yeah, they are headhunting some young talent right now across the NHL. A lot of the Eastern Conference teams, actually, 3 key pieces for some franchises over in the Eastern Conference that can be cup contending or playoff contending for next season as well. We'll see what the Edmonton Oilers are trying to change very, very shortly. But thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. We appreciate all the support you show us. Hammer that subscribe button, hammer that follow button, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, leave some comments on the YouTube channel. We really appreciate all the conversations and feedback we get from all of our listeners out there. Remember to tune in this off season, this summer. Flip and I will be dropping some hints, some details for next year's fantasy league all summer long. You don't want to miss out. And what you can expect all summer long are these conversations with these young, talented players across the NHL that could potentially be on the move. You have to be on the lookout for what players are heading where to a new team. And one team, again, the Edmonton Oilers, are already looking to get better, improve their talent and their roster for next season. One of them, or I guess I'll just name off all 3 guys that, you sent me that picture the other day. Travis Konecny of the Philadelphia Flyers, Victor Olofsson of the Buffalo Sabres, and Brett Pesce of the Carolina Hurricanes are 3 guys it seems like the Edmonton Oilers are targeting or checking out right now this offseason. Let's start with Travis Konecny, though. Definitely a guy who his name has been thrown around a lot the last 6 months, and what his status might be with the Philadelphia Flyers moving forward. I know you've mentioned it. Maybe a few teams in the Eastern Conference are looking at him, but the Edmonton Oilers seem to be really, really impressed with this guy and could make a big trade and swing a trade for Travis Konecny.
And one of the things here, and obviously not Victor Olofsson, but Brett Pesce and Travis Konecny are 2 players that really don't get pushed around a lot, Steele. And I know Travis Konechny's 5'10", but he plays with edge. 77 penalty minutes this season, 55 hits, 38 blocks. Maybe not the grittiest of guys, but he plays with edge. Brett Pesce, 6'3", I believe I saw that. 6'3", big bruising defenseman.
Big guy.
The Oilers got physically outplayed at times by the Vegas Golden Knights. This isn't rocket science here, Steele. They know they might have to go back through Vegas once again in that big bruising lineup of good old Canadian boys. What was it? 19 of 25 of their starting lineup or so roster was Canadian boys. Anyway, I just think we know that the Edmonton Oilers are knocking on the doorstep. We've talked at length about the goaltending. We've talked at length about the blue line. And I think all they're really missing, Steele, is another good piece. Matthias Ekholm worked fabulously. That was one of the best deadline moves. Say what you will about Ken Holland. That one worked out. I just think that they're knocking on the door. So for a team to be already mentioned like the Oilers, that they're going to be active, it just makes so much sense to me. And man, oh man, if Travis Konecny can get added into the mix in the top 9, Pesce makes sense. Victor Olofsson, I don't know. But to me, Travis Konecny going also under contract for 2 more years, I believe, Steele, at a very reasonable, was it 5.5?
Yeah, it's around 5.5.
$5.5 million for the next 2 years. Edmonton might have to shuffle the deck here or pay a pretty penny for Konecny, but I would absolutely love that for the Oilers and his fantasy value.
Well, look what it did. Look what it did to Vander Kane's fantasy value when he signed that contract with the Edmonton Oilers as well. So if Konecny gets traded to Edmonton, it skyrockets his fantasy value. But he's a very intriguing player. It's his first 30 goal season this past year. Finished with 61 points in 60 games. So he was a point per game player this past season. Yeah, he only had 15 points. Only had 15 points on the power play, but again, he missed 22 games. Also, the Flyers had the worst power play in the league at 15.5%.
Thank you.
So if he goes to the Edmonton Oilers, that's one of the best power plays, if not the best power play in the National Hockey League. So a guy you said, decent for Banger League, 77 penalty minutes, only had 55 hits, but he is a little bit nasty out there.
Chippy,
Plays a chippy game. The peripheral stats are good. He's only 26 years old. He's been very impressive over the last 5 years. And every single year, he always just seems to get an extra groove or an extra gear that really just helps him improve his game. So Travis Konecny is a guy to keep an eye on. Again, if he goes to Edmonton, fantasy value skyrockets probably to the top 6 rounds in the fantasy draft. Another guy, though, Victor Olofsson, I find very interesting if Edmonton were to go after Olofsson as well. Because I'm looking at it from the Buffalo Sabres standpoint. I want to ask you this question, and this would be a very interesting conversation to have. Buffalo is sitting very, very pretty right now. They are set up very nice for the future. Yep. Buffalo has just under $17 million in cap space. They have 3 young goalies. 2 of them look very, very promising, obviously in Devin Levi and Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen. They've locked up Dylan Cousins. They've locked up Tage Thompson. So, of course, we know Rasmus Dahlin is the next guy that's going to get paid, and he's going to get a monster contract. But I'm just looking at their roster right now. Sorry, I'm going on a little bit of a Steele flip.
Go off, brother.
I'm looking at the roster. So they've got those young guys locked up. Dahlin's next. Quinn and Peterka got 2 years left on their entry-level contract. Power and Krebs have 1 year left on their entry-level contract. They've only really got one guy that's an RFA, which is Tyson Jost, and I wouldn't mind seeing him back in a Sabres uniform. But the question here is, if the Edmonton Oilers and Buffalo Sabres are somehow going to swing a deal, do you think at any way the Edmonton Oilers would even consider parting ways with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins if the deal was right?
Yes, I do, because I think Ken Holland is a very smart GM, and I think there's something to be said about selling very high on a guy who might not scrape. What, he had 93 points or something this year? He might not even scrape 70 again. And if there's some GM out there who kind of saw the flash in the pan and is willing to pay a price, if I'm Kenny Holland and I'm getting the right return back, Steele. Yes, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins was a nice thing to have during the regular season. Where was he at in the postseason? You know what I'm saying? So I'm going to say 100% if the return is right. But they're also in a very nice position themselves with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins because of the season he had. On one side of the coin, you go, hey, I'll sell high and I'll move him now. But on the other side, maybe he does return to 75, 80 points. Either way, right now, they're looking nice. My thing is, Steele, at the end of the day, they know what they aren't. They've now lost to the Stanley Cup winners 2 in a row. And they've been somewhat close. I think they actually lost both those series in a 4-2 fashion. But they need to make moves because I think I have been very adamant on this show. If they don't start winning, and I mean cups, Leon Draisaitl and Connor McDavid are going to not re-sign here. And I know they're both under contract for a few more years each. They're not coming back. And actually, if things go really haywire, Steele, I'm going to my agent and I'm going to say, keep your ears open because, hey, they're not getting any younger. And I know McDavid's only getting better and so is Draisaitl, but you know what I'm saying? At the end of it all, keep your eyes peeled to all of these situations, though, because they're going to have fantasy implications for your squad, which Steele and I will have covered every single week throughout the summer.
And I'll say this, they don't have a lot of cap space to work with this offseason, just over $5 million in cap space for the Edmonton Oilers. So they might have to make a trade like that. But I think, again, if this is just spitballing some trades here and some names
Spitball
around,
away.
but if the Buffalo Sabres are able, because you look at the roster again, it's a very young team. I think all they need right now, when I look at Buffalo at the stage they're at, it's either you go out and you get a really good veteran centerman, or you get a veteran goalie that can share the crease with Devin Levi over the next 2 seasons before he's fully ready to become that starter.
I like that.
So Ryan Nugent-Hopkins at 30 years old, he's just over $5.1 million in cap space with 5 years left on his contract. I think, again, if Buffalo, they've got the picks, they've got a few prospects, and they've got a few players on their team that could swing a trade for a guy like that. So never know what could happen. But again, the Edmonton Oilers are going to be a very busy team this offseason. And so are Flip and I, of course, on the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast every single day, all summer long. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast your first listen every single day. Make sure you're tuning in Monday through Friday, 7 o'clock in the morning Eastern time is when you can find all of our episodes. And again, thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode. Good luck with your bets out there, if you've got any bets, and we shall see you back here again tomorrow.
Peace.